Bishops at the government feeding trough has been the status quo for half a century. But now enter Donald Trump, and not just with MAGA in tow, but specific parts of MAGA dominated by faithful Catholics, like Catholic Vice President J.D. Vance, who's calling out the social justice bullshit, as the Irish would say, along with the bishops and their phony baloney establishment Catholics. For the first time since the sexual revolution, dissident Catholics who have ruled the roost our entire lives are now playing defense and are completely off balance. All hell is breaking out, not just in D.C., but also in the Catholic Church. And just as the massive eruption, however unfortunate, is needed in D.C., it's also needed in the Catholic Church. In each instance, D.C. and the Church, the status quo is held by enemies of the institution, political enemies in D.C., and theological enemies in the Church. Faithful Catholics have come to understand that the establishment of the Church, including large numbers of bishops, jettisoned the faith long ago and substituted it with variations of liberation theology, which is, in short, a gospel of Marxism presented as the authentic gospel, which it's not. In the United States, this largely took the form of so-called social justice, which replaced the faith, albeit subtly, at least most of the time. This has been going on publicly now for decades, all the way back to the 1960s. I was an 8-year-old altar boy right here in Texas when the very first social justice collection was taken up. It was done at the instruction of the then recently established National Conference of Catholic Bishops, which changed its name to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, the USCCB, in 2004. The conference was established back in 1966 by the Archbishop of Detroit, John Dearden, who 3 years later picked Bishop Joseph Bernardine as his right-hand man to force all the other bishops to bow to the newly introduced social justice gospel, which most of them did. And to demonstrate how bad theology folds into bad policy and politics, therefore, Cardinal Dearden was the first archbishop in America to fool around with the liturgy. For non-Catholics, we're talking about the Mass, Sunday Mass. He flipped the altar around to face the people instead of God, involved so-called Eucharistic ministers, the sign of peace, communion in the hand, non-sacred music, and the removal of the tabernacle from the sanctuary, and a whole bunch of other things. Then, once he had used Detroit as a kind of petri dish from 1968 onwards, he called a conference in July of 1976 where he assembled hundreds of liberal lay people from dioceses all around the country to produce a document of every church teaching they wanted changed. Ironically, the Call to Action Conference was held in the exact same building where Wayne County Democrats cheated on Election Day in 2020 to steal Michigan's electoral college votes away from Donald Trump. Kind of makes that unholy ground, I think. Needless to say, the agenda reads like a laundry list of every liberal Catholic desire, starting with, of course, abolishing all the teachings about sexual morality while promoting a female priesthood and, of course, social justice. While nothing was officially done with that list, those delegates went back to their roughly 200 dioceses and did everything they could to put that agenda into place in their own backyards. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why the social justice gospel is so deeply rooted in American Catholic life all these decades later. Not because it is a work of charity, far from it, but because it's the vehicle used by liberals to smuggle in the destruction of the authentic faith under the guise of good works. The whole idea, the plan, was to slowly erode the faith of normal Catholics by changing the liturgy, downplaying the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, give constant, nonstop sermons about equality, downplay the sacrament of confession, and so forth. Of course, they didn't want to get rid of the appearance of the faith. They just wanted to pull a switcheroo and make normal Catholics think that the most important duty was to help the poor. When the U.S. government started handing out tax dollars by the billions to help with social justice, the bishops and their unbelieving phony Catholic staffs were right there, hands wide open, all for the poor, of course. bishops at the government feeding trough has been the status quo for half a century. But now enter Donald Trump, and not just with MAGA in tow, but specific parts of MAGA dominated by faithful Catholics, like Catholic Vice President J.D. Vance, who's calling out the social justice bullshit, as the Irish would say, along with the bishops and their phony baloney establishment Catholics. For the first time since the sexual revolution, dissident Catholics who have ruled the roost our entire lives are now playing defense and are completely off balance. And their cash cow is now being slaughtered. The tens of billions the bishops have sucked from the teats of the deep state over all these years are now cut off, done, over with, fini. It's it. The jig is up, again, as the Irish would say. That said, now it's time to start the criminal investigations and possibly even explore RICO charges, because this effort was a highly organized scheme across state lines for decades, where various Catholic officials cashed in to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars in salary and other compensation. Again, money coming from you. It's always good to know that you can get rich helping the poor. Another important related point, as the authentic faith was being diminished and believing Catholics were being browbeaten by the bishops and their staffs over all of these many decades, another thing was happening that didn't get exposed until just about 20 years ago. The far-flung systematic rape and sexual assault by active homosexual priests of thousands of minor altar boys, covered up for by these same bishops who were replacing the authentic faith with their social justice crap. Since it all started to come out, the bishops have had to pay out, get your calculator out, $5 billion, that's billion with a B, for their sins and their crimes. Talk about a RICO case, ripe for prosecution. Looking at you, Pam Bondi. So step back, big picture here. The long line of U.S. bishops who worked to undermine the faith, who also covered up the most heinous of crimes, are the same bishops taking billions from U.S. taxpayers and using that money to undermine the nation. And they used the gospel of social justice to accomplish both. And for the record, the entire liberation theology movement, which spawned the social justice gospel, was created in the Kremlin to advance world communism. Social justice was the enormous financial profits and the large-scale diminution of the faith, all brought to you by the communists. Who would have thunk it? Coming to you from Houston, Texas, yeehaw, I'm Gary Michael Voris. God love you.